to our webinar. My name is Danielle Locknane, and I'm the Channel Operations Manager at DirectDefense. Welcome to Beyond Patch Management, a webinar that, you guessed it, will go beyond patch management to discuss what to do about those unpatchable threats. Here on the webinar with us, we have Catherine Chipty, Senior Director of Solutions Engineering and Alliances at Automox, Jim Broom, President CTO at DirectDefense, and Phil Brass, Senior Evangelist at DirectDefense. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. The chat button is disabled, but if you have a question for the panel, please ask it in the Q&A. And if you want to further the conversation after the webinar, please feel free to email us at marketing@directdefense.com and we'll set up a call for you. So I will pass it over to our panel.
All right, who wants to start?
How's it going, gang? So yeah, as far as the stats and everything that we were kind of going over, pre-gaming there. Phil, you want to take us away there, buddy?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw, let's talk a little bit about some 0 days to get started. I think people are worried about them, and it's for good reason, right? They're definitely used by these surveillance vendors, people who sell access to your devices. They're hard to defend against, and the discovery of them and finding them in the wild is increasing. Although I think from 2023 to 24, we saw a slight decrease, mostly attributed to those surveillance vendors just getting better at hiding their 0 days, right? Seriously, they're not actually fewer. It's just that they're a little bit better at not tipping their cards to Google and other researchers. So yeah, I think we're looking at, we saw almost 100 in 2023, 75 in 2024. 44% of those were against enterprise software products, primarily security products these years. A lot of people doing espionage are trying to get into organizations, and that front-facing layer is always security products, VPNs, firewalls, right? Security appliances. So they're always sitting right out there on the edge, and so they're very commonly targeted. And then the other 56% or so is end user stuff, mostly browsers and mobile phones, right? Those are very common targets for 0 days as well. So we definitely see them increasing in prevalence. I don't think the problem is going away anytime soon, right? And that's just the 0 days, the ones that we don't know how to defend against. There's plenty more vulnerabilities. I mean, just general reported vulnerabilities have been increasing steadily for, decades now. So yeah, definitely lots of problems. But on the 0 day front, where we don't have patches, what are some things we can do, I guess, is the big question. How do we try to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely start with a bit of even just a sanity check on that point you mentioned, Phil, right? We all talk about this a lot, even as a group. Vulnerabilities in general are increasing at a rate that, I mean, is almost just like this Sisyphusian problem where, it doesn't matter how many resources the team have, they're just not able to keep up, right? And on top of that, I always like to ask this question of any groups, but I haven't seen any teams quadruple in size, right? Like the number of vulnerabilities.
Correct.
And like, feel free. I mean, if you have quadrupled in size, let us know, because that's where the budget is, I guess. And you guys are, one of the outliers. But it's always, we have to do more, right, with less. And so this idea of vulnerabilities is kind of typically like two main categories we see. Like, hey, there's stuff we know we can patch. And even that, teams are having a really hard time, I think, proactively staying in front of and reducing. And so I think the reason we wanted to have this conversation was, even if you patch well, so right, even if you're one of those organizations that manages to kind of get your third party and your operating systems under control, Phil, to your point, there's this whole world of 0 days that like 0 days configuration changes, the non-patchable vulnerabilities, right? My
hardening, compartmentalization, right? All of the different
acceptable risk.
That too. Yeah, you see plenty of problems caused by people just accepting risks and not doing anything about it. And I think that's one of the results one of the strategies people take when they do get overwhelmed is say, here's how much money I have that I can dedicate to fixing things, and then everything else has to be risk accepted because there isn't any budget for another approach. So as teams, they grow by 4x, like some of them are shrinking by 10%, 20%, right?
Yep.
Fortunately, not our SOC is growing, but like lots of other organizations are seeing cuts in their security budgets, and so how are they supposed to stay in front of this kind of stuff? I think it's
Yeah,
an
I
important
mean,
question.
exactly. I mean, it's really the problem statement is twofold. Number one, you have an existing tech debt. You've chosen to operate your business on the following technologies and solutions inside of your environment, and it's on you to quote unquote keep it functioning, keep it running. With modern operating systems, aka the ones that are 5 years or younger, there is an ecosystem. They've gotten better because, Bill and I can definitely talk about back in our day, the late 90s, early 2000s, where it was a crapshoot. We are seeing advances such as companies like Automox solving the problem. The biggest problem statement we saw post-pandemic or during the pandemic was work from home. It broke every existing enterprise patching model back in the day. And so Automox had a great story around just being able to cloud deliver software at scale for organizations and actually address this, core fundamental problem of modern systems. However, we now have an ecosystem of legacy systems that we're dealing with, and specifically, we are choosing to operate with broken software. And the one that we all can go back to time and time again, especially because it's made the news so much in the last 3 years, is Log4j. With Log4j, we had the initial impact in the industry. Now we have this recurring residual impact where we've chosen to continue to operate a broken platform. We tested to make sure that it wasn't exploitable 6 months ago, and now a developers updated their code base and pushed a new feature set that allows the exploitivity of this legacy problem.
One extra logging call, right? And
Yeah.
and now you're vulnerable again. So
Right.
yeah, if you don't filter everything.
Yeah. So how do you address that problem at scale? And there's been a lot of whack-a-mole going on, but again, directly to the Automox story of there is an ecosystem, there is not only just users but also the product maturity as you've come up with worklets inside the platform specifically that would give you that fine grained control to actually start looking at those solutions.
So
Yeah.
what are these worklets?
Yeah. So, when we talked about those problems of patchable, non-patchable, and delivering them from the cloud, there was this big emphasis on, well, what about, delivering the configuration changes necessary from the cloud? And so the approach that Automox took in its platform is what we call worklets, but the best way to think of them is just, scriptable automation. So we use PowerShell and Bash at its core, which was very important to the team because you've seen certain companies kind of like they write their own language, right? Things that users have to learn. There's enough out there for teams to have to learn, right? And so the idea being kind of this common denominator in terms of anything you can script on an endpoint, you should now be able to also automate and add that back into your baseline, basically, is what I say, right? So not just as my baseline, hey, criticals need to be patched in 24 hours, third party in 7 days, and maybe OS in 30 days. But what else do I consider as an organization to be compliant? What do I know makes me feel safe? And that can be anything as simple as, well, I should say simple, but admin permissions is the one I laugh about because we've had companies come up to us, Jim, to your original use case of, hey, if you can just get rid of these admin permissions from my remote users, like we'll get the tool right now. It was such a big problem for something that really shouldn't be, right? Because they're not getting in front of these laptops anymore, and they don't have the correct visibility. And so now for a lot of these companies, like we're trying to encourage them to have the discussion of, in general, that risk appetite's a great positioning, right? What are the low-hanging fruit projects day to day, things that you don't want in your environment in terms of risk? And that could be admin permissions, right, which are scriptable. That could be disabling USB ports, because I guess people are still dropping USB sticks in parking lots, and that's still a thing that happens.
We do it during pen test. Yeah, absolutely. It can be very successful.
Yeah, just like wearing bell bottoms. What's old is still new again. So
exactly. Bell bottoms, and then also I think skinny jeans we're circling back to again.
Yeah, unfortunately that wasn't my genre. So
missed a good one. Yeah, so USB, disabling SMBv1, right? Again, things that people, to your point earlier, Phil, might have started just accepting as risk, right? Hey, we don't have a great way of controlling this, or we're having to do these pretty massive sprints and projects to get through one configuration at a time. Now, right, the goal with Automox is basically saying, hey, this is what I want enforced. If you see drift from that baseline, bring it back to the center once a week, once a day, right? However aggressive you want to be. And so you've kind of got these two pillars of the immediate actions of 0 days, which might be kind of a one-time, hey, I need to remediate Log4j in a way that's not patching, right? It's actually opening up the jar itself and making adjustments so that you're no longer vulnerable. Or I want to keep Flash uninstalled from my environment, right? If you ever see it, remove that thing. Don't patch it, because it's giving me about 100,000 vulnerabilities. And so, starting
Per
to
install.
exactly per install. And so, it's been really fun mindset shift kind of discussions to have, because I think to your point earlier about patching, Jim, it's one of those things where we still aren't doing that good of a job as an organization. We've had to have this mindset shift. And when you said, hey, Automox came into the space as the first cloud native tool during COVID, think about how long other security tools have been cloud native, right? A decade at that point. So this whole remediation side of the house and the risk appetite has been really, really lagging behind, considering how advanced security tools are, and then subsequently how advanced the attacks are, right? So it's a little bit on kind of worklets and where we're starting to try to drive companies to think about that proactive risk reduction. Don't just set a baseline for patching where you can, but set a baseline with the configurations, right? With the 0-day remediation, and go beyond patching. So plug that title in there.
Hey,
with worklets, one thing I want to understand is, can I tell which machines, like say I have a bunch of machines and I want to remove administrator access, is there a way to say, hey, just check and see which ones even have administrator access? Or is that not, you just have to say, go ahead and run it on all of them, and hopefully it will, it'll just remediate automatically. So you can have it go and check and kind of poll your environment, give you some information on what needs to be done.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Actually, it's funny. Well, and the reason Jim knows is because we all sort of drink our own champagne here, right? From a security standpoint. So
we use it. We're also a client.
Really
but yeah, I mean, just kind of doubling down or double clicking on a couple of themes there. I mean, you hit the nail on the head, which is, when we talk about the unpatchable, we talk about the legacy problem in organizations. What we're really talking about is maturity as a program. And for a lot of companies that come to us, especially during incident responders, that's where we get to see all the skeletons in the closet, and everything that didn't get approved or didn't get done for the past decade came to fruition. And now we're at a point where we can actually start recovering, and more importantly, adding resilience to the program. So one of the things that we do as part of our playbooks for incident response is not only deploy SOC technology to give us visibility on how bad the environment is and make sure the bad guy's not still in there hanging around, but secondarily is starting to get an idea of what is the tech debt for the organization, how they can actually start thinking about remediating. And so, like, again, the easy stories, and I'm using air quotes hard on this, is OS. Microsoft has spent nearly 3 decades explaining what Patch Tuesday is all about. I think we got it, at least the concept. We don't really do it in practice, but we got it as a concept. What we're lacking is the same discipline for everything else we have on the system. And so when you really get into vulnerability data, slicing and dicing, and patching data, slicing and dicing, desktop apps are the number one problem, and they're the number one avenue for compromising, regardless of if it's a workstation or a server, because we install browsers on both. We install copies of Office all over the place. We install anything Adobe makes, and that's me being snarky as a pen tester. They have a whole litany of products. Yeah, it doesn't really matter. If you can't patch it and you can't see it, which comes back again to fundamental of asset management for maturity, you're going to struggle. And where we're really seeing the best progress, outside influence like CISA, for the federal government, and also pushing that to insurers, but you're pushing that to their customers, aka us. At the end of the equation is, you need to have an actual baseline. You should have an understanding of what is a workstation, what does your organization support, and when does it go AWOL. And so what's nice is, again, we have Phil and I come from the vulnerability and exploitability world, but it goes directly back into administration as well, which is really the patch management side of things and configuration management of, here is your benchmark of associated, configuration for Windows 10, Windows 11 workstations. Here's your virtual desktop. Here's your server configuration. And when they move, which they will, because your admins are going to do it, or your users are going to make it move, then you've got the ability to actually see it, to Phil's, use case scenario. And then actually with, the automation built into it, if you see the baseline change, you can revert the change or push the, fix back on
Take it
it.
back.
So
No,
yeah,
you can't have Flash, right?
right. Yeah. And so getting that ecosystem where I like to go with it, which is trying to get with less is more. You don't have enough people, so you just need this thing to maintain it for you. There is, a lot of new players coming at it from different angles, but again, patch management, configuration management is a core discipline of IT. And teasingly, it's one of those main pillars that every insurance provider is looking for. Do you have a firewall? Do you have log management? Do you have an antivirus EDR? Do you have patch management?
Right.
Anything else like identity access management, privilege escalation, all the other fun stuff, that's fifth place.
MFA.
That's all fifth place. It's the first four that they're going to measure and, more importantly, choose or not choose to actually pay out your premium, or pay
Yeah,
off
and
pay off your issue. So yeah.
if you want to have good pen test results, right? Like
Mhm.
you need to have a hardened environment and everything needs to be patched well, right? Like you cannot, you will get owned during your pen test and of course also during actual adversarial activity
Yeah.
unless you're keeping up to date and you decided to harden things and you're following all of these best practices. So it really is a good set of things. All right, I wanted to touch on another topic since we're talking about configuration and since actual IT people really love configuration management. What does Automox do in really mature environments where they have ServiceNow and they can't just make changes willy-nilly, go into the Automox IDE and be like, okay, let's just apply this everywhere, right? Does it integrate with ServiceNow? Does it work with other config management tools? How does that work?
Yeah. The change management piece for the large enterprises, Phil, to your point, is always a topic that comes up. So not just how do we integrate with other tools, but how do we track the change management? And are there also like buffers and rails if something goes wrong to
Right.
back? Not
Yeah,
just
well, we're all still remembering CrowdStrike, right? And how that was a patch, right? It was an
Yeah.
update that failed. So it'd be great if, I mean, to hear about what you guys have for, oh, I can apply patches in the lab first and then promote them to, the regular workstation environment or
yeah.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So let's start with the internal, kind of how we think about orchestrating that change management and the patching. So everything in Automox from an automation standpoint is schedule based, right? So there could be things like December blackout periods for retails where no patches get delivered, right? But we're still gathering that information of what patches are missing. We're still categorizing, hey, is it critical? Is it third party? That way, companies do have the ability to go ahead and deploy on demand if needed, right? Without having necessary automation during those blackout periods. April for the IRS, things like that, during sports games for sports and entertainment customers, where, a lot goes into, to your point, that change control. These are all uptime businesses. Their revenue and the core of their business depends on things not happening at certain times, right? So we do have that. On top of it, this is technically a configuration and a worklet, right? But we do have the ability to mass push rollbacks, which I think Jim was nodding his head to, because it's something we've all had to do, right? To your point of Microsoft is Microsoft, and that's going to happen. And so, just being able to plug in this KB or these 5 KBs, I need you rolling them back, right away. And being the cloud native tool, we don't have those dependencies of, are our end users on the VPN or, whatever the kind of
Connected to WSUS or whatever. You can get them from anywhere. Okay.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Actually, and even double down. I mean, it's nice to have a point in time, like you're pushing once a month, but stuff comes out in the case of Chrome, 5 updates in a week.
Right.
So, having that solution to have your back and actually be able to automate 75, 85, 95% of your desktop environment or your primary tool, for using the box in the first place is highly competitive in this era. So
It is a big target.
Yeah, they've been going off all past 2 weeks, just constant updates. And so giving your users some flexibility. Again, even this idea that Automox has implemented, which is basically like a countdown methodology of, as the administrator, you decide, hey, for criticals, you really only get 4 hours to delay this reboot, because we think about what really at the core of disruption for end users and for the uptime of the business is the actual reboot itself. So, hey, if it's critical, you only get 4 hours or 8 hours to defer this reboot, right? Maybe Jim, Phil, as bosses, you can get a little bit extra time. No one wants to disrupt your day, your end user.
No, we practice what we preach, and we're a little draconian about it. So occasionally we'll let the cat out of the bag, which is our salespeople hate us. Simply because we have enforced compliance. So you get two times to say not now, and on the third one, it's going to actually do it right there in 20 minutes.
Right in the middle of your Teams call with a prospect. Yeah, sorry, I had an update roll out. I'm 5 minutes late.
Yeah, exactly. See, that is sort of the methodology to start moving teams to, and I love that practice preach. And so, these are sort of some of those ways internally the tool will implement sort of change control. And then you also mentioned the exact use case of, hey, first schedule to kick off is to a test group, right? And then maybe day one, as a patch is available, that goes to my test devices. Then maybe as a patch is 7 days old, we start to automatically roll that to internal. And then when the patch is 15 days old, we can roll that to external. And so what you're starting to do is implement this automation by default. But that's not to say that, hey, day one, I had that roll to my test and I'm noticing things I don't like. I'm just going to pause that day 7 rollout, right? Like, I don't want you automatically rolling out on day 7. And then that last piece, which is, I think, really important, right? Especially as we started talking more about Automox's kind of future in alliance and having hands in XDR tools, vulnerability management tools, ITSM, right? Reporting tools. It goes very beyond just what we do and what we control. And I'm seeing a lot of this line being walked with tool consolidation, but also the enterprises do need best of breed. And so really what they need is best of breed tools that work together effectively. And so a lot of that use case we see in change management is, hey, my vulnerability scanner is detecting vulnerabilities. We're categorizing that into reports, and it opens up a ticket into my ServiceNow, right? Letting that team know they basically got a job assigned to them, or, there's a project or a patch or a configuration that needs to be done, or it's a 0 day, right? And there is no patch. Then what we go ahead and do is, on either the automated schedule or right on demand, if somebody in Automox has seen that ticket within their ServiceNow and they actually run a worklet to make that configuration change, or they do execute the patch, right? We feed that information back into a ServiceNow to say, close out this ticket, right? The patch has been completed because that vulnerability scanner has also redone that scan. We know that vulnerability is now closed out. And so that feedback loop is super important to teams. I think even less so from a change management standpoint anymore, but from just tracking, right? Really tracking also the effort that these teams are doing, the work that they're doing, so that they can go back and say, whether it's through their pen tests or their audits or something, does happen, they had a really crisp process in place. And so it's been really fun, not just helping that mindset shift, but also getting to support it through our tech alliances.
Well, I had another question I wanted to run by you, which is, as we see this large increase over the last year or so in 0 days and exploits targeting enterprise security software, because it's so easy, right? Because a lot of it is facing the internet, these VPN servers, right? Avantis and Palos and things like that. While I wouldn't necessarily say Automox is internet facing, although I guess parts of it have to be, do you guys have a product security program? Like, what kind of product security work are you doing to make sure that Automox, which has a lot of elevated privileges in a lot of enterprises, isn't itself a vector for compromising people?
100%. And I love this question because I very rarely see this, but our head of product is actually also our CISO. And so that changed about 2 years ago, maybe even 3 years now at this point. But, it came from a few different things at its core, right? You can kind of see security was a huge part of our business, of our roadmap, right? So he had a huge part in secure by design, right? I know as a saying everybody says, but I think we really did put our money where our mouth is when he stepped into owning the product role as well. And it works not just because when we talk about drinking our own champagne or eating our own dog food, right? He is in charge of those IT and security teams that are living this day to day. But at the same time, the most critical thing for him, after you've seen, in the news, what's happened with some of these security products, technology, SaaS, and then subsequently for their customers, was that everything we do here at Automox is built with security top of mind, right? And again, it's not just us saying that, it really is putting our money where our mouth is in terms of leadership and influence that security has completely over the product development, over the roadmap. And so, there's a few different things. I think the most important piece at its core is just high availability. And so a big stress on no single points of failure, right, with Automox. And so we do that in a few different ways, right? Even at the core of the tool, when you talk about deploying patches, right? Automox is the only vendor today that scans those patches for malware before deploying them to a customer's environment, right? So we're also part of Microsoft's MAP program. So the first ones to hear about any internal Microsoft vulnerabilities or threats so that we can go ahead and either hold on patches before automatically deploying them, or be able to create those worklets and configurations if it's a 0-day for regedit, right? With like print nightmare is what came to mind as we were saying log4j, but everyone's that have come right since then. So that early information and response. Being cloud native, right? Securing any type of data transmission is critical. So encryption of the data, no matter where it goes, as it stays in flight, is secure. That rolls kind of into the AWS partnership and cloud security that we've implemented. And then everything from where, someone like you all will come into place in terms of our pen tests, in terms of SOC 2, SOC 3 compliance, PCI, GDPR, right? The team is always staying on top of not just what we can do, but with the actual, facing reports and compliance that we've also collected, the risk assessments that we do in our environment, red team, purple team testing. So I could probably talk about this longer than maybe we want. But,
Yeah.
I think you covered it well though. And it
Yeah.
sounds like there's a portal somewhere on Automox where I can get a list of, like, I can download those reports, at least the customer facing versions and things like that, and check out your SOC 2 certification and all of that.
Oh,
So
100%. Yep. Yeah. It's available to anybody to view and sign up. If you're considering the tool, right? Security.automox, we'll go ahead and maybe make that part of the follow-up too, because it's a good point, Phil.
awesome.
Yep. And even double down, like just kind of going down some of the feature sets, on the AWS side, that's a common, secondary environment that we're getting caught into time and time again, specifically with, cloud infrastructure or container infrastructure with microservices being leveraged today. I can tell you from the SOC side of the equation, it's a great concept, but it's terrible practice for security visibility. And I know for a fact it's also a patching nightmare and a maintenance nightmare if you're only building a box or a container that only lives for 30 seconds at a time. One of the things that we've been advocating is, again, implementing patch management automation tools for configuration for the gold image. But I just wanted to kind of, toss it back a little bit to see if there was any other, best practices you'd kind of go for or recommending these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think from that perspective, targeting the gold image and setting that baseline is really important, right? It sounds like very basic, but when you go back and you talk to teams about their programs, right, a lot of them don't even have patching SLAs because there's this sentiment of, we really haven't ever been able to do it. Again, we're up against a losing problem. So we don't want to set ourselves up for failure or to look bad. And so it's kind of it's a 3-part problem of like people, process, product. I feel like it always comes down to, there's definitely a mindset shift that needs to happen on the people side to really start to enforce automation in ways where it hadn't been before. Right, process also needs to be reevaluated in terms of where have there been gaps, right? Where are there those low-hanging fruits, those manual activities? And product obviously is a huge piece that needs to help you report on and verify the progress that you've been making. And so, when it comes to recommendations, it's maybe taking a step back, looking at those 3, and not shying away from the basics, right? Or almost like starting fresh, for lack of a better way to say it. think about kind of basic patching protocols, and then when we talk about beyond patching, I guarantee you with a little bit of digging, you'll find those low-hanging fruit activities where help desk is remoting into devices to try to sort of solve for, whether that is something like uninstalling an application, right? Or making sort of security software is installed, or making some sort of reg edit where necessary. And look where, tool sets like Automox can set that baseline beyond patching. And you sort of like, I like to say, just like sort of collect those side quests, right? It doesn't have to be everything at once, but it's like, hey, there's this little thing, little configuration change that we've been, taking up so much mental real estate and so much time from our team. We know we can automate this with confidence, right? Or also hold your vendors accountable to show you what that is. You've got vulnerability scanners in place now. You've got, pen tests that you're doing with your providers, and start to add those, right, into whether that is, like you said, from a virtual perspective, AWS, your golden images slowly, little by little is better than nothing. And then your general, global environmental baseline as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of take the other example of, when we walk in during incident response, everything's kind of a big ball of death, if it's running great, if it's not, it's probably locked up. And so like one of the things we were challenged with is getting an idea of what was in the environment prior. And so like one of the ROI stories I have for patch management platforms is literally like, it just, there was nothing there. The container is already come and gone. There was no forensic evidence preserved, anything along those lines. But I could at least go back to config management and patch management and actually say, okay, well, here's what I think is probably there, and then confirm it on the current image that's running inside the environment. So again, it's just having something to tell you what was running inside of this environment that's no longer there. It's a nice way to actually go back.
Having the patch management logs so you
Yeah,
can see
yeah,
what
just
versions
like
were
the
running
old
on which computers. I get it.
right. Yeah, and so like just trying to find like what was in the environment at the point of time to say, okay, this is might be causality. This is how they got in, and then go from there. And so yeah, teasingly, I've actually used Automox and other vendors just to be able to piece back like what was running in this place before everything, went belly up. So.
It's such a good point, right? Because a lot of what we try to talk about is like proactive. I say that word all the time because again, if you've got 4 million risk score with your vulnerability scanners on one device, right? It's super hard it's impossible to manage that, right? If you're trying to reactively chip away at 100,000 vulnerabilities, you're really not going to get anywhere. And so this idea of proactive is like reduce your risk 90% off the bat, because you know where the risk is coming from patches. We know where the big configuration risks are, like log4j or flash or a certain reg edits for SMBv1, right? Kind of top ones. But it's somewhat of a pipe dream to hope that everybody can implement, right, a proactive approach before, to your point, something has happened. And so even on the other side of it, understanding where there is still kind of light at the end of the tunnel and where, we can support teams is super interesting.
Exactly.
Jim, I remember when we were talking about this initially, you had some interesting, what's the word I want to look for, kind of best practice or goals or like numbers around what your unpatched percentages should be, right? Like,
yeah.
What were some of those? I hope you recall them because I don't. But
sure. Yeah, this is one of my talking points that I spout off. I'll way too much.
Yeah.
So yeah, when we talk about patching and using barometer, how effective is your IT organization? One of the things we do from a pen testing standpoint is, yes, we are giving a grading letter score, if you will, to how well the organization is running operationally. We spent money on a patch management platform. What's our tangible ROI out of this? So having a recording story to go back, and so the simple crux of it is workstations, for better for worse, over the years we've kind of gotten, it's okay to reboot on the user. We'll deal with the problem at the help desk level. So when you were gauging the barometer, if because of Patch Tuesday with Microsoft, if 25% of your problem is patching debt on a Windows workstation across the organization, that's kind of a fail. I mean, it's that bad that that is the current landscape. So if you're struggling to do, and the slice of the pie showing that more than 25% of your patching problem for operating system or workstation operating systems, you need to go evaluate what you're doing. We talk about servers. The barometer for OS patching is around 35%. So anything over 35% is kind of it's a fail. We've got 20 plus years from Microsoft telling us to run patches. The question is, it's not so much a personal failure, it's an organizational failure, it's a process failure.
Right.
But we are, turning tools like patch management back into a, grading scale of, are we really
Yeah.
getting ROI out of the organization? Or when we're presenting risk, which is really the majority of this conversation goes back to, to the board, because they got to sign off on it, and it's, they're the ones signing up for it. Here's what's going on. Here's the investment. Here's the landscape. And so we can have a numerical conversation or just a reality conversation of, if these things come into play, we're going to have a problem here. And, we've been able to see
And
that time and time again of just taking patching data and measuring the quality of the organization.
I feel like a lot of times that problem can be solved by the board with budget allocation, right? And you need a way to say, okay, look, we're at the red line or over the red line on this, right? We need to spend more money delivering better, patching, because we just aren't at an acceptable level right now, and we don't have the time, or we don't have a system, we don't have Automox or some other patch management platform. If you don't have what you need, then, like the organization, it's almost like you want to say, look, this is an unacceptable level of risk. You can't just accept it anymore. We're past that, to where, it's a lack of discipline, and we really need to get our IT assets under control.
And I
Yep.
think as the vendor and the partners here too, it's always important to talk about this to our attendees, like hold your vendors and partners accountable, right? I
Yep.
see too
Preach.
often, like I'll see vendors that don't lead the ROI conversation, right? Someone is coming to you, testing your solution, like be intentional with asking, right, and holding them accountable for, well, how am I supposed to make this business justification, right? What do your other customers do? And it's something that we're very particular about, again, trying to be proactive with, of this is what you came to us with, this is the before state, the after state, this is, where we're seeing other companies similar to go implementing, right? Reporting was the biggest priority for us this year. That was finally released in April of, well, what about my MTTR improvement, my mean time to remediation improvement, right? What about even things that are a little bit more subjective, which is like time savings, right? This is how much time we spent on these configuration projects or these patches versus now what we're automating away, total cost of ownership. So it's part of why I've been here so long. I think that it's very rare to find a tool or space that can really quantify value in a very, very specific way. And so, that's why I definitely encourage anybody on this call or in general to, hopefully push more and more vendors to be accountable in, quantifying value, where it's not just, a nice to have, or, words like AI, ML, everything that we've seen everywhere.
Right.
Yeah, and you can even double down on that one as well. I mean, one of the things we do a lot is spend, teaching our own consultants how to write with context. The thing that gets lost is, oh, I'm just here to pen test XYZ Corp. And, I got in and, I was able to do the following things and take advantage of this. And this is how I got the keys to the kingdom.
Right.
But rewind that back, like first part of the conversation, like, hey, how much do you guys spend this year? Like,
Yeah.
let me write this in context for you. And I distinctly remember, several instances of Phil and I having to go back and kind of retweak. Is like, yeah, we got in. It's kind of our job. So why you hired us in the first place is what we do. So you're probably not going to win every time. Realistically, that you should expect not to win. But the secondary part is like, you guys are actually pretty good. It took us an hour and a half. Context is it usually takes us less than 20 minutes.
Right.
Especially when the gloves are off and we're allowed to really go for it. And so, it's those type of things of learning how to write with nuance and write, to your point, kind of give some, like you guys spend a lot of money, you put a lot of things in place. Yes, I got it in because you missed the one box that was under Phil's desk.
Because it's one failure, right, for the
Right.
attacker to win, or at least to gain elevated access and call it a win. So yeah, I think it's interesting. There's always that asymmetry, and the defenders have to be perfect, and the attackers just have to be wild and crazy and flail around
Course.
until they find one thing.
Brute
So,
force it, right? Spray
yeah,
and pray, 100%.
Mhm.
yeah, absolutely.
I don't
And
know.
then I believe
Oh,
also one of the other things you guys have in there under your updates on your benchmarks are password enforcement. So policy
right.
enforcement for standalone boxes. Just saying, highly
The
recommend.
CS
Yeah.
North Star. Yeah, exactly. Forcing password complexity, 100%.
Speaking, you mentioned AI earlier. I'm just curious. I know every vendor at RSA had an AI play. Is there any AI going on at Automox? Is there a co-pilot for patching? Are the reports generated by a large language model? Like, how's all that figuring into what the product is doing?
Yeah, a few things actually. So, we talked about worklets, we talk about
Mhm.
scripting, but I think one of the things that's been an interesting implementation of AI with Automox was how do we start to use, AI in terms of going from, basically plain text to creating PowerShell scripts for us so that I
Oh,
can, if I'm not script savvy, I'm not a scripting guru. Yeah, there's places where I can just, GitHub has pretty much everything out there, but being able to have those nuances of, just telling the Automox Auto AI, hey, I want to write a script that checks if SMBV1 is enabled and then disables it if it's not, right? It'll kind of go and take that, turn it into a PowerShell script, and definitely not recommending you just run AI generated scripts in the
right.
environment. So, as an
But
app.
push it into the test lab and see if it works, right?
Yeah, exactly, right. It's just that incremental time savings, that incremental support you feel like you have, right? Attackers are using AI to generate, malware to generate attack vectors for them, help them exploit it. So there's kind of this idea and this hope that, teams don't have to feel like they need to be perfect or have every bit of knowledge in the world, but you can use that same AI to start supporting and creating those script, right? Creating those defenses, even just starting out, right? Being able to see what PowerShell commands actually disables or enables a reg key is super helpful for beginners, right? To be able to see that process out of the
Yeah.
gates. That was a really, really good implementation that we've seen, adoption for on the actual worklet configuration side of the house. And then you kind of mentioned the language models or even just, plain text reporting and creating custom reports was also another area where we wanted teams to be able to say, hey, show me the amount of, patches that were deployed in the past X amount of days, or just show me where, these versions of patches were deployed, show me just criticals. And so this idea of, again, accountability and quantification, taking all the data that we have and making it kind of accessible and manipulatable by plain language rather than having to be a SQL expert, right? Which again,
Right.
the farthest thing from, has been another interesting implementation, right? Beyond that, we've had a lot of conversations around how do we start using AI and kind of training our own model to start detecting, right, best kind of practice implementation of patches or pre-patch, post-patch work. We can safely say we don't feel confident in where AI is today to start actually having it take action in the environment for you. So, right, recommendations first, and we're doing a lot of that with our partners in the vulnerability management space as well, which I think is really good to see. But I'm also happy that people aren't jumping to use AI to actually take some sort of action on the device itself.
We've got a few questions in the Q&A. We're 45 minutes in. We might as well pivot over and start answering some questions. The first one here is, how do you prioritize remediation tactics when patching isn't an option? So, is it isolate the host? That might be a possibility with a lot of impact, or is there a way to harden a registry key or uninstall a piece of software? Like what are the frameworks that we use to make that decision of what the best option is?
Yeah, I mean, from the attack and pin side and the defender side of the equation, our answer is always going to go back to exploitability. What is the actual method of
What's
exploitability,
the
and do we
best way to remove that, right?
yeah, how can we minimize it, reduce it, or completely eliminate it? Like, just
Eliminate
making sure you
exploitability.
can't get to it. The best example, we've got some modern ones, but I go back to the 15 years ago. One of the things that pen testers we were commonly recommending, especially with the legacy busted Java app, and you have JRE installed on every desktop out there, and you're basically playing Russian roulette because JRE was so broken, still is.
And it was available in every browser. Like, you would go to a
Right.
website and it could just load up JR, the Java environment, and run an applet, right? Like,
Right. But we were finding people still running a legacy Internet Explorer at the time, And because of the XYZ app that was like the SRP app or whatever they
Right.
ran, the keys to the kingdom would only work on this one browser. I'm like, great, create a virtual desktop,
Right.
let that busted browser live there, modernize the rest of your work fleet, and just change the way they access the app. That's the simplest way of just minimizing access, but keeping it around. But to that point, if there's a way to implement a workaround, then we all scramble to look for that. And then more importantly, this is where, can Tai Chi back over to Catherine there, which is you use the worklets. They're actually there and they're there to help you roll out the O-Day. But when it's truly unpatchable, it's minimize access, or minimize access. And then as the forensic guy, log the crap out of it.
Log
So we can
everything.
log everything so we can see if and when it does happen, we at least have evidence and methods to see it as it's occurring.
Yeah, 100%. And look, this is a bit of like a dorky answer maybe, but we do really enjoy our partners and communities, right? Like look at the community that you all have created at Direct Defense, right? Look at the community that other security vendors have created. It's something we try to lean pretty heavily into as well, as far as like what's out there, right? What's most exploited, whether it's your industry or, just currently in news. Like I think about that a lot again. And attackers are communicating a lot more than we realize, right? And so the question of how do you prioritize remediation when patching isn't an option? You can kind of look at what's most prevalent in the world in your industries, and then use other tools and companies to either run those pen tests for you all, right? Vulnerability management tools to see what's specific and how to prioritize the biggest threats, right? The threat exposure management tools that are so popular today are becoming more and more popular to say, sure, you got 100,000 vulnerabilities, but based off of, your configuration, your industry, and a few other factors, these are the most important. So I would say definitely don't feel like you have to go at that one alone.
Trailblazing,
Yeah. Yeah.
Next question is, do you recommend layering CIS controls with other frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001, that kind of thing? Who wants to jump on that one? I have an answer.
I'll take
Go
that
for it,
grenade,
Jim.
which is the answer is
Yeah.
yes, but test.
Yeah.
So go through and see where your
Yes, but
duplication
test.
actually is inside the environment and see what the most bang for your buck is. You're going to find some exceptions. Personal example is, we're largely a Mac shop over here. So while, there are some great standard, solutions, I understand why they're making some recommendations. I'm a big advocate of hot corners. That's how I invoke my screensaver because I hate pressing control, was a command control Q to lock my screen. I just
Right.
want to throw my mouse in the right hand corner and walk away from my desk. So figure out which ones are going to be viable for you. But yes, layering them, you're adding on top of it. NIST is a really good starting point. I don't advise jumping into 853 unless you are bound by 853.
Yeah.
Start
Maybe
with
like
171.
CSF, right? Let's start
Yeah,
with NIST CSF at the base
exactly. Yeah.
levels and go from there.
Yeah, but you're going to find when you get under the hood, about 90% of it is the same thing over and over again. So you're really only implementing, out of 1,500 controls, you're probably deploying 400. Or you can even back that down to something, a little bit more optimized. But it's kind of the point of, say what your framework's going to be, test it. If you run into hiccups or problems, write your exemption on why you didn't do it, and
Right.
then keep going and maintaining from there.
I will say 100% to that point, right? I don't know if maybe this is just me, but I have seen organizations where like this striving for perfection, right? Or like, do we layer on, multiple frameworks? And it's this thing like something is better than nothing. Like even to an SLA we talked about, it's like just start with something, even if it's 30, 60, 90. Start with one framework, right? You'll do a little bit of research for your industry, for your company, your environment, to your point, Jim, your operating systems, right? What you have in the environment. And then, so it's not a no to layering, but it's if you feel like your organization is going to get bogged down with this idea of layering or trying to figure out, where those overlaps are, start somewhere, right? Something is better than nothing. And then to your point, start to document on where that got you, point A to point B, where you foresee gaps, or, when you start to look at the next framework to layer in there, you have something to go off of.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
think
teasingly, go ahead, buddy.
I was going to say, I think CIS very much focuses their benchmarks on individual information systems, and big frameworks focus on entire organizations, right? So really, these are complementary systems,
Right.
and you can absolutely use them in a layered fashion, right? CIS for the workstation, NIST CSF for everything, right? Including what your workstations are doing.
Right.
So,
No, exactly. And that's almost to outside of system management, when we talk about compliance and framework management, everybody steals from 853. So,
Right.
it's a derivative of, it's just to figure out exactly which ones they didn't, bring over and carry forward. So yeah, starting within the standards is the best practice. The, CIS controls especially get into the nuance of this specific version, this specific OS, this specific configuration of an application source. So it gives you a little subtle nuance beyond just framework management. So.
Awesome. I feel like that one's answered. The last one I have here is we started using registry key changes as part of our hardening strategy. Any advice for safely rolling these out across multiple OS versions? So excellent question. It is so easy to say, oh, we'll just, edit this reg key and it's going to be fine. It's not always going to be fine. Even, you could make a change in an application registry key that might have one impact in version 1 of the app and an entirely different impact in version 1.2, right? So I think there's definitely a lot of potential for impact and downtime and bad things like that if you just started pushing these things out willy-nilly. So what do we think the right, strategy is for controlling impact in terms of making these kinds of changes?
Yeah,
I mean,
go ahead.
I think
Go ahead.
we touched on this a little bit, right? But the testing in a controlled environment is going to be the easiest elementary answer, right? Like having those test machines, VMs, whatever it is, to those different versions.
And VMs might be the most economical answer as well, right? Like you don't necessarily have to say, hey, I need budget for, 5 server machines and 20 workstations, right? If you can get VM coverage just enough, right? Then maybe that's a good economical way to do it. So I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I completely right. It's why we talk about it. I think it's what we do internally, right? With very limited resources and budget, things like that. But then on top of that, one of the things that we do make sure to do is like when Automox recommends a worklet or when we do create one, we do test and monitor. So it kind of goes back to use the different forums, communities to kind of check for like we don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? What companies or what other individuals or engineers have actually done this before, what to expect. And then we kind of layer in the testing ourselves, in a very controlled environment to help mitigate some of those concerns there.
Yep, and just to kind of double down on that is, besides the testing, the actual rollout phase, be cognizant of the fact that you can actually make a decision tree on which baseline gets applied to which OS, and you can get down to the build level. Thankfully, Microsoft, to their credit, and that's largely who we're talking about here, doesn't do too many wonky things from one major from one build to a sub build. But there are nuances from time to time, and so we will have one build specific registry patch as opposed to the other. So if you can apply based on your knowledge of your asset environment, where you're at in your life cycle, like Windows 11 today, which OS is your primarily rolled out, which one are you going to in your next 6-month journey, that is advisable to basically start those frameworks. While I would love to simply say it's just Windows 11, sometimes there is nuance that you have to apply and do your baseline rollouts along those manner. And same thing for Mac. Honestly, Mac is far worse. One major OS breaks everything, especially anything security related.
Oh yeah.
And so it's a common, everybody shaking their head over here for Silicon OS or Silicon Mac
No,
systems.
yeah, you're 6 months behind in like CrowdStrike versions or things like that or whatever, right? Like you're like, hey, we got this new version. It's like, no, don't install that yet. Nobody installed the new version. Nothing is supported on it. So it's absolutely, they break a lot of stuff.
Yeah, well, even in the latest, they've gotten better, but even sub releases have actually caused and impacted problems. So, again, a baseline is a great way to start how your configuration journey is going to go. And but again, major OS changes, always test every single one. Sub OS changes, really monitor before you roll out. So it's like monitor to see if there's any problems or nuances, like, for example, in Catherine's example, where they're actually, sourcing across their user base to see if there's any issues specific to this sub version, to roll that out or roll that back inside the environment. So, but I mean, that's kind of the bigger, like if you can start at OS level, by all means, go for it. Realistically, get down to your build levels if there's that much nuance in the environment. Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Did you have something on that, Catherine? Or I think that's the last question.
Yeah.
No, and I think we did awesome with timing too, which is
Yeah.
always tough. So
So I'll defer back to Danny. You want to come back on?
Can you see me? Okay. Thank you guys for coming. If you have any further questions, feel free to email us at marketing@DirectDefense. But if not, we'll be sending out the recording to you. So if you want to rewatch it again.
Thinking.
Thanks,
And thank you,
everyone.
Catherine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you
well
very
for
much,
having
Catherine.
really appreciate it. Like I said, appreciate this discussion. If you've had to listen to me before, obviously I love patching, but you can tell there's it goes beyond just that. So
It does.
hopefully you guys all left with some good tidbits on how to implement that.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Bye
Thanks.
everyone. Have a good rest of your day.